of Now This and the appeal. Today we are joined by Representative Khanna from California's 17th District to talk about the Peace Act. We're also joined by Dr. Philip Atiba Goff, CEO of the Center of Policing Equity, which promotes policing transparency and accountability. The Peace Act would change the use of force standard for officers to make it a last resort and require officers to employ de-escalation techniques. The act aims to change the rules of engagement for police by requiring states that receive Department of Justice policing grants to adopt new and more restrictive rules for police conduct. This bill was introduced by Representative Khanna and Representative Clay in August 2019, on the anniversary of Mike Brown's death. It is being advanced now in the midst of protests against police killings of Black people. Protests have occurred in more than 2,000 cities and towns in the United States, and in more than 60 countries worldwide, after the recent police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, Andres Guardado, and too many more. There are calls from around the country to reinvest in communities by defunding local police budgets, which frequently amount to hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases billions of dollars, every year. The calls are urgent as states and cities plan to cut funding in the areas of healthcare, education, and housing while we're in the midst of a global pandemic. More and more people are saying, enough is enough, that it's time to reimagine public safety. Our guest today can help talk about what that might look like. Thank you for joining us, Representative Khanna. There's an important vote tomorrow. Can you please tell us a little bit about the Peace Act? What's your goal for the bill, and how did you arrive at this proposal?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to Dr. Goff. It's an honor to be on the panel with you. I worked with Lacey Clay on the Peace Act, and it's very simple. Almost every other Western democracy abides by human rights international law. And international law and human rights law says that force should be a last resort. You should not be able to use force unless you've taken every means possible to prevent it. In our country, we're still governed by a 1989 William Rehnquist decision that says force is allowed if it's quote unquote reasonable. Well, the reality is that juries have been deferring to what an officer thinks is reasonable. We should change that standard, and we should make it clear that officers can't use deadly force, can't use force unless it's a last resort. Let me give you a very clear example of how this would have changed an outcome. If you look at Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was murdered because he had a toy gun, the officers got to the scene and they basically started shooting. There was nothing said about put up your hands, drop your weapon, where they would have found out it wasn't a weapon, it was a toy weapon, or techniques that would have clearly saved Tamir Rice's life. So this is not just a legalistic point. This would save lives. I'm confident it will pass the House, and then it will go to the Senate, and we'll see what happens there.
Can you talk a little bit more about this distinction between reasonable and last resort, and kind of how that plays out around the country? What's the current state?
Sure. Well, the current state, it depends state by state. There are certain states that do have a last resort standard. California, my state, has adopted that, but there are other states that just have the standard of reasonableness. And then it's supposed to be objectively reasonable, not what an officer subjectively thinks is reasonable. But by and large, what we've seen is judges and juries are very sympathetic to what an officer says is reasonable. So in my state, one of the reasons I did this bill was because of Stephen Clarkson shooting in his own grandmother's house, which happened in my state. And the officer could say, well, they were acquitted in part because they said, well, I thought it was reasonable that we shot. But if it was last resort, people would say, well, what couldn't you have done other things? You didn't have to kill this young man in his grandmother's own backyard. There are other ways that you could have done things. Did you give warnings? Did you take every preventative step? So it's a much more restrictive standard. And here's the thing, I think it's not only going to save Black lives, it's going to save police officer lives. I think it's going to force de-escalation in a way that's going to just make society less violent.
Thank you for mentioning Stephon Clark. I remember that case was devastating. How do you see this bill interacting with other progressive calls for things, for example, completely shifting the role of first responders, where you have like healthcare experts that arrive at the scene or social workers. How do you view this bill in coordination with other calls for change?
Well, this is one part, first of all, of the entire House bill on justice and policing. And the House bill is going to ban chokeholds. It's going to make sure that we don't have qualified immunity for police officers, so police officers can get sued. It's going to change the legal requirement on how to hold police officers accountable. So you can just show that police officers acted with recklessness to get them convicted. So there's a large bill, and I really commend Karen Bass, Hakeem Jeffries, and others who have really shepherded this through. The challenge is going to be whether it gets a hearing in the Senate, where they don't have as robust a commitment to structural reform. More broadly, I mean, look, I think we need police departments, but I think the question, as Robert Reich asked in a very poignant op-ed, is do we have more resources towards social control, towards police, prisons, and the criminal justice system, or should we have more resources towards healthcare, education, infrastructure, mental health? And what I would argue is that our balance has been off in many of these cities. We have had 40, 50% of budgets going to the policing, the surveilling of communities, and dramatically underinvestment in nutrition and education and healthcare. And so I think what a lot of the activists are saying, they're not calling, in my view, for disbanding police departments. What they're saying is let's have a more healthy distribution of these resources, which will ultimately lead to a better society and less crime.
Absolutely. One of our colleagues was describing these calls for defunding and reinvestment, and she said it's not super different than what many people already experience, which is they don't regularly interact with police because they have nice neighborhoods and good schools, access to healthcare, right? So this idea of defunding and thinking differently about our values and our budgets shouldn't be that dramatic of a shift for many people. So thank you for mentioning that. Can you talk a little bit about the political landscape currently? So what's happening in the House and what can we expect in the Senate?
The House, the landscape has totally changed. I mean, when Lacey Clay and I introduced this bill on Ferguson's 5th anniversary, we had about 24 co-sponsors, basically the Congressional Black Caucus and some of us progressives. But now there are 230, I think, co-sponsors on the Justice and Police Act, meaning we don't just have the progressives, we don't just have the Black Caucus, we have mainstream, moderate, frontline Democrats who are in Republican districts. And that just shows how much the politics of this issue has changed. So I'm very confident we're going to get the House bill. And then the question is really in the Senate. I mean, they're proposing something that is just not the structural change that we need. And look, I know Tim Scott. We've worked together on certain issues, but the point is that bill does not have the structural reform that is really going to bring the type of change we need, which is a change in the standard of force, which is a change in holding police officers accountable.
Thank you, Representative Khanna. Dr. Philip Atiba Goff, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. Can you explain how the existing rules of engagement play out in day-to-day policing?
Yeah, sure. It is exactly as Representative Khanna explained. If you feel like it is reasonable to use force to compel a lawful order, you can use force. So let me explain that sort of without the legalese. If you're doing something that I think you shouldn't be doing, and I give you an order that I say for my safety or yours, you have to obey. Let's just say, example, randomly, you're selling loose cigarettes. And I say, you got to give that up, get to the ground. And you say, you're not going. You say, please don't touch me. I've had a long day, right? I can use whatever force I need to get you to the ground, right? And that force might ultimately end your life. Part of what we've seen over the last, not just several months, right, but the last 400 years, is we've seen state executions, summary, in the streets that have been way out of proportion, not necessarily to the amount of resistance, but to the initial infraction. Eric Garner died because he was selling loose cigarettes. Richard Brooks was killed because he was asleep in his car. And people will say, no, they were killed because they resisted arrest. They should have complied. They should have. well, we have visual evidence that that's not always sufficient. But the point is, can't we imagine a world where we didn't need to end up there, where cops didn't need to be the only people that we could call, and where it didn't have to end up being life or death because someone reasonably feared for their life from police? The way this plays out is that law enforcement has wide discretion to use physical force to compel compliance. And most people seeing what we've seen in these viral videos just in the last couple of weeks, much less the last many years, think that that's not the way we should structure society. We absolutely have the power to change that.
What do you say to folks that say, changing the use of force standard is not going to make a big difference because officers, if they want to kill you, they can kill you, right? Whether that's by fear or something else. Can you give a couple examples of, cases we've seen in the past where it would have made a very clear difference?
Well, I mean, Representative Khanna used the example of Tamir Rice, where not only did the officers not engage in de-escalation, they themselves produced unnecessary risk, right? They got right up on someone who they thought was armed, inside of a couple of feet, and inside of 2 seconds, that 12-year-old child was shot and killed, right? So, I mean, the example of Eric Garner might not have been dead, right? Especially while someone is filming, when you say, this person is here for a loose cigarette. George Floyd for a $20 bill that maybe wasn't any good. Almost every one of the examples that we can bring from memory, all the hashtags that you have in your Twitter account or that you've seen on your Facebook feeds, almost every one of them, we can imagine a different way, right? The rest of civilized society doesn't kill 1,000 people by the state in the streets. We do, not even necessarily because of bad officers or racial bias, but just because we think it's okay for law enforcement to use guns in a country where guns are out of control. We don't need to do it that way. And instead of having arguments about whether or not, well, they shouldn't have resisted, or whether or not, well, it's because of the crime, or what, we can just imagine a way so that we have communities like we do in the suburbs where they don't have to call law enforcement as their only resort because they have better resources available to them. That's, I think, where we should be focused. I think one of the tragedies of this moment is not just all the loss of life, is that we have to sit around debating this bill, right? Representative Khanna is 100% right, but why is there a debate about it? Why was there a debate about it? Why were there only 20 co-sponsors in August of last year? Because it should be incredibly obvious that you shouldn't use force on someone unless you absolutely have to. We teach that in kindergarten. I'm sure we can teach it in the police academy.
Thank you for talking about reimagining police and the debate and how that debate's changed. You've been really close to this issue for so long. What have you seen in terms of the both political evolution and just like the messaging around these issues?
Well, I wish I could see that we're on that arc of the moral universe bending towards justice, but to me it feels like we're hanging on the bottom of a grandfather clock, swinging back and forth. And we swung pretty far towards the windows being open, the possibilities being in front of us. But watch your national news broadcasts, right? Watch cable news. They're not leading with this anymore. There's still tens of thousands of people in the streets. But the national and the cable, the local news is getting it, but they're not talking about this nearly as much. And we're maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks out from this not ranking anywhere within the broadcast. What that means is the window will close, the urgency will dry up, and we'll see exactly the same thing that we've been seeing each and every time we do this. 6 years ago in Ferguson, 30 years ago in LA, 30 years before that in Newark and Chicago and Tulsa. We see this every 30 or so years. And the thing that I hope everybody remembers is that the only things that are in common, Black vulnerability, state violence is the spark, and then we all forget. So what I'm hoping is that on the other side of this, some basic humanity finds its way into our laws, right? Because that's really what we're talking about, is the floor of this that would prevent some people from being killed because the laws can actually be used to hold people accountable. But I'm also hoping that there is a bigger appetite for sustained change, that when this is done and the cameras actually stop, even when the locals stop paying attention, that we don't look away. Because there are some communities where we don't have the option. And if folks really want to be co-conspirators and allies in this, they'll join us in staying focused.
I've heard a lot of folks talk about feeling like they're between hope and history, right? I think this is a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar quote, which is this idea of, folks being hopeful, seeing the movement in the streets, but understanding that, this, for at least 100 years, these same debates have been happening, like you mentioned. Ro, can you jump in? How are you feeling in this moment And what do you hear from folks in your district about change and the possibility for change in this moment? Oh, I think you're muted, I think.
I think we have to look at this beyond just reform in the criminal justice system. If you look at, people say, well, technology now is capturing these images with the iPhone. Well, technology captured Emmett Till's lynching in 1954. It was photographs right across the country that sparked that outrage. And yet we still have such systemic inequality. Now, in part, it's understandable. Look, this is a country that had 250 years of slavery and then 100 years of Jim Crow. So 350 years of a view of blacks as less than in the social order. And to think that just 50 years of a civil rights movement is going to get us to equality was naive. And I think the one thing which has happened in my district is people have woken up to the fact that there's still racism. Race still matters. That this is actually, you look at Silicon Valley, where you have 1% of funding to Black entrepreneurs, where tech companies are notoriously poor in diversity. And their numbers are bad, not just for the engineers and scientists. People keep saying pipeline problems. Why don't they have good numbers for lawyers and communications folks? So I think what we have to do, it's very easy to say race is the problem of the other. It's the problem is the cop in Minnesota, and that is the issue that we need to address. And people can feel comfortable saying, well, that wasn't us. We would never kneel on a black man's life and kill him to death. But I think what's called for is much more introspection. How are we part of systems that have perpetuated inequities, and what can each of us do in our lives to overcome racism? And I'm hopeful that is the type of conversation we're going to have.
To that point, there's been some encouraging movement in the data. So a new report from the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress shows 7 in 10 voters support creation of non-law enforcement emergency responder programs. Another report shows 8 in 10 believe community-based violence intervention programs are an effective response to stop cycles of violent crime. How does changing rules of engagement support these policies, and what is your ideal vision for how crises are responded to, for example, when someone calls 911? And there was a lot of questions there. So,
right. Well, I think your basic point is correct, which Dr. Goff also made, which is that, most of us, I grew up in a suburban town in Philadelphia, a middle-class neighborhood, but the experience with police, there may have been 1 or 2 times because that you could have been profiled, but by and large, the experience then is if you get pulled over because you're speeding or on a stop sign, right? And most people's experience with police is limited to that. And so I think what people are saying is, why are we having this escalation over a $20 counterfeit bill? Why are we having this escalation over loose cigarettes? Why are we having escalations over toy guns? And it's not just the 1,000 Black lives that are being killed. That's obviously a violation of dignity, but it's all of these young Black and Latinx boys and girls who are growing up with fear, who are growing up with a sense of a concern and alienation from society. There's a deep harm. And so I think what people are saying is, let's think about how we structure police so that police are also, in most cases, community builders, that they are doing the work of empowering communities where, I'll just end with this point. I've got a young son, and my heart skipped because he sees police cars and he says, "Oh, look, police car," and he's fascinated by it. Right now, I'm thinking, okay, if you're Indian American, maybe that's different than being Black. And what does a Black kid think when he sees a police car? And what are his parents telling him? Right. So how do we create a police presence in communities where they view police like people in white communities or in Asian communities do, as a resource, not as one to be feared? And I think that goes to the heart of equality in a democracy.
Absolutely. There was a story recently, with a father explaining how, not just the talk, you hear about the talk, but just this idea that his children have only known trauma, right? And this is from seeing Black people killed, with regularity, watching them on video, but also just like a global pandemic, like all of these things have happened, and our children are looking and saying, like, how could you let this happen to us, right? So that point is very well taken. I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk about the vision and leadership of the Democratic Party. So, for example, Joe Biden recently came out against defunding police and instead looking at community policing and giving $300 million to community policing programs. What do you think is the Democratic vision for policing in this decade, and how it's emerging? We talked a little bit about it, but what would you like to see emerge from this moment? Because we may not have this moment for long. Dr. Goff mentioned we have this cycle, right? So like in this moment, how can we use this momentum and really push for a broader vision of the society you both have been talking about? And both of you can, or either of you can take that.
Well, I think it's important. I think we start with getting the bill that the House has proposed passed and making that law. And then I think we have to have a conversation. I mean, even though people may be opposed to disbanding police departments, and I don't, I mean, I think we need police. I think the question, we shouldn't get caught up on the nomenclature. I think the question should be, how do we structure police departments that we aren't having disproportionate funding for them compared to health and education in a society? And how do we do it in a way that you don't have escalation for basic offenses, small offenses? And how do you make sure the police are more community role models? And I think if we've gotten so caught up in what do we label this, in my view, that there is probably much more consensus on the 80–90% of the type of reform that we need. And I think we should work with the vice president to get that kind of reform, and the Congressional Black Caucus and the NAACP and other civil rights groups and people like Dr. Goff.
Yeah, I got to say, Representative Khanna is, I mean, it's a rare thing, I guess. We're having a public conversation and everybody's in agreement because there's some basic principles of human decency here. You talked about 7 in 10 folks who are voting eligible saying they are in favor of non-police responses to certain kinds of emergencies. You know who else about 7 in 10 are in favor of that? That'd be police chiefs. I've been working with police chiefs for the last couple decades of my life. I have never met a police chief who said, you know what we really need to do? When families are having a difficult time with their kid, or there's a noise complaint for a party, I think we should introduce a badge and a gun. I've never met an officer who thinks that what they want to be doing is arresting a 16-year-old kid for smoking a joint on the weekend, right? This is not controversial. We have certain folks who benefit from the distraction of imagining that we really disagree with each other and that it's about our clans and the other side are really stupid. But like, there's not really a community that says we're safer because we have to call the police. Every community would rather not have to call the police, and the police would rather work in communities that don't have to call them all the time. And they'd rather not be tasked with absolutely everything. So again, regardless of what any political party has a vision for, it's not that hard to look at folks who are living in these communities and see that the vision they have is the same vision that law enforcement has for itself and has been crying out loudly for the last couple of decades, with the exception, law enforcement hasn't been asking for their budgets to get shrunk. Because so long as we're asking them to do too much, they're worried about giving up the money too soon. So that's a fight that we're gonna have to have, but we're gonna have to have it either pitching it as conflict or pitching it as, like Representative Khanna said, we agree on 90% of this. Now let's figure out the path to get to the place where that agreement lives in our communities.
Thank you for mentioning the law enforcement point. I was at an event earlier this week where the Orange County Sheriff was talking about working himself out of the job, and this idea that, for example, the Orange County Jail is the largest mental health provider in the county, and like how all these services that could really help and improve people's lives are defunded, right? And so he would never claim that he was supporting defunding, but implicitly his comments were supporting this idea of reinvestment and looking at those services. So I appreciate that. I know you both are very busy. I'd like to see if you can offer some words of action, right? There's a lot of friends out there who are overwhelmed in this moment. They they want to help, but there's so many things moving. What can people do this week to help move this forward?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank the people who've been out there in protests on the streets. It's been inspiring to see. It would have been uh, depressing if after George Floyd's modern day lynching that you didn't have that kind of response. So the fact that we have that kind of uh, energy, activism, people risking their lives really with COVID to be out there shows the more capacity of our generation of people now to bring change, and it's having an impact. I mean, I just saw it on the Peace Act. I mean, the fact that on something like that you went from 22 co-sponsors to 231 shows that the democracy it can make a difference. And I would just say also that the language of activism, the language of what people are feeling, may be different than the language of a politician, and we shouldn't be censoring activism. I mean, there's anger out there, there's frustration out there, and people are expressing that. And then it's for people in politics to channel that and to figure out how do we take that and bring real change. I guess I share Dr. Goff's concern that the question is, does this become like Emmett Till's lynching was, a moment that really has us across the board in criminal justice, inequity in education, and inequity in jobs, and inequity in wealth. Racial wealth disparity is growing in this country over the last 3 decades. Do we start talking about that in real ways and acting on that? Or is this more fleeting and we get back in a couple months to the normalcy of accepting Blacks' opportunity is less than in a social order? I mean, that to me is the real racism. It's the normalization of inequity. And is this going to force that change or not? I think that remains to be seen. I'm hopeful, but that's going to depend on how sustained the activism is and how much it awakens people in positions of power.
And just building exactly on that, I think that the number one thing I've been telling people that folks can do is strap in. There is no chance that any amount of legislation or any amount, frankly, of reallocation of funds is going to prevent the next George Floyd. There will be another one, and another, and another, and another. And some will be captured on film and some won't. But for sure, we're not going to have exactly this kind of moment. So my hope is that people don't look away, that they pay attention, and that they start to educate themselves so that the next time they're in better position to advocate for the things that they believe and for the things that this country is supposed to stand for. Learn who the heck has the ability to fire and hire your law enforcement executive. Learn, who the head of your local union is. Learn if there's a civilian review board. What stuff is public? When is the next union contract being negotiated? Can you go for a ride along? When's the next public contract negotiation for public comment? And who is doing the work locally? Who's doing the stuff to actually reform police in your community? It's in the same thing where you should know who your representative to Congress is. You should know who is in charge of your law enforcement. Now, if you're lucky, your representative from Congress grew up in suburban Philadelphia, the greatest city in the history of the world. Not that I'm from Philly as well, but I am. Right? I'm just saying, if you're lucky, that's what you get. But you should know these things because ultimately they're doing this in your name. And so the next time that there's a body on the ground and we're all upset about it, you don't have the excuse that you couldn't know if you don't. So strap in, because this is the march towards equity and eventually towards freedom. It's a long march. So get some comfortable shoes.
Thank you so much. That's both sobering and empowering. I appreciate both of your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we have a busy day on the briefing. We will be back with Emily, who will be talking to Julian Castro. We also have a show, that'll be Seeking Shelter, a conversation on housing in America. We'll also be talking about what would non-police first responders look like. So it's a busy day. We're covering a lot of topics, and we really appreciate you both, just coming on and enlightening us on what's moving and how we can plug in.